Go ahead, the CEO said with a confident smirk. Fix it, and I'll spend the night with you. Laughter rolled across the penthouse like soft thunder, bouncing off 20-foot glass walls and polished stone floors high above the Chicago skyline. No one in the room believed the challenge meant anything because no one believed the man standing beside the silent control panel had even the slightest chance of succeeding. Malcolm Brooks looked at the broken system without reacting. He did not smile, argue, or glance at the woman who had just spoken. Instead, he quietly set his worn leather tool bag on the floor and removed a pair of work gloves that had clearly seen years of honest labor. The executives exchanged amused looks. To them, he was simply another repair technician called after a week of failed service appointments, another name added to an expensive list of disappointments. Victoria Sinclair folded her arms and leaned against the marble kitchen island, her tailored ivory blazer perfectly pressed, every movement reflecting the confidence of someone who had built a billion-dollar technology company before turning 40. She had watched software engineers, robotics specialists, and international consultants examine the mysterious failure that had shut down every automated function inside her newly completed penthouse. The lights still worked. The elevators still moved. But the artificial intelligence system controlling security, climate, communications, and power balancing had gone completely silent without leaving a single trace of why. The manufacturer blamed the installers. The installers blamed the software. The software team blamed the electrical infrastructure. 7 days had passed. 7 teams had failed. Malcolm slowly studied the ceiling instead of the touchscreen everyone else had been staring at since sunrise. His dark brown eyes followed the recessed lighting, then the hidden ventilation channels, then the narrow reflection running across one corner of the panoramic windows overlooking Lake Michigan. His calm made people uncomfortable. One young executive whispered, "Does he even know where to start?" Another quietly chuckled. Victoria heard them, but said nothing. She was curious now. Most technicians filled silence with excuses. This one filled silence with observation. Malcolm finally spoke, his deep voice steady enough to quiet the room without asking for attention. "May I ask one question?" Victoria nodded. "Go ahead. Has anyone opened a window since the failures began?" The room fell strangely still. Several people frowned. One consultant laughed outright. "What does that have to do with an AI network?" Malcolm simply waited. Victoria looked around the room before answering. "Not that I know of." Malcolm walked toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, stopping where the morning sunlight painted thin golden lines across the hardwood floor. He rested one hand lightly against the glass, closed his eyes for barely 2 seconds, then opened them again. "Interesting," he murmured. Victoria tilted her head. "You already found something?" Malcolm looked back at her, not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. "I found something everyone else assumed couldn't possibly matter." No one answered Malcolm immediately because the question sounded almost absurd compared to the millions of dollars of technology surrounding them. One of the software architects cleared his throat and opened a diagnostic report on his tablet. "The issue is inside the network," he said confidently. "The environmental conditions have already been eliminated." Malcolm nodded politely, never challenging the man directly. "Maybe they have," he replied. "Maybe they have not." He slowly removed a compact multimeter from his tool bag, followed by a flashlight no larger than his hand and a folded notebook whose pages were worn smooth from years of use. There were no expensive digital scanners, no custom computers, and no dramatic gadgets that matched the luxurious apartment around him. His tools looked ordinary because Malcolm had always believed that experience mattered more than appearances. Victoria watched every movement with growing curiosity. She had expected another confident speech or another promise that ended with another invoice. Instead, the repairman behaved like someone solving a puzzle that had already begun speaking to him. She noticed something unusual. He never rushed. Every glance had purpose. Every step seemed measured. Malcolm crouched beside a narrow access panel beneath the entertainment wall and gently placed his fingertips against the brushed aluminum surface before opening it. Warm air drifted across his hand. He remained silent for several seconds. "Has this room always felt warmer than the rest of the penthouse?" he asked. Victoria frowned. "I honestly do not know. I have spent most of the week in conference rooms." One of her assistants quickly answered, "The climate system has been unstable since Monday." Malcolm smiled slightly. That is more helpful than you realize. Across the room, several executives exchanged skeptical looks. They still saw a maintenance contractor making educated guesses. None of them knew that Malcolm Brooks had spent nearly 20 years repairing electrical systems inside hospitals, airports, museums, and research laboratories where one overlooked detail could shut down an entire building. He had learned long ago that machines almost never lied. People simply stopped listening to them. Years earlier, he had accepted a management position with one of the largest engineering firms in Illinois. The salary had been impressive, the office overlooked the river, and promotions arrived almost every year. Then his mother was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Malcolm quietly resigned without complaint. Friends called him foolish. Former colleagues said he was wasting his talent. Malcolm never argued. Flexible repair work allowed him to care for her, prepare every meal, drive her to appointments, and still earn an honest living. Prestige had become less important than presence. Victoria knew none of that as she stood beneath the soft morning light pouring through the glass walls. All she saw was a man whose confidence did not come from titles or expensive clothing. It came from patience. Malcolm reached inside the open panel, paused, then slowly looked upward toward the towering windows once again. "Miss Sinclair," he said calmly, "before I touch another wire, I need everyone to stop searching for a software failure. I believe your problem began long before the first error message ever appeared." The room became completely quiet. Even the consultants who had been whispering a few moments earlier lowered their tablets and stared at him, waiting to hear what no one else had managed to see. Victoria Sinclair studied Malcolm Brooks for several long seconds before she answered. The confidence that had filled the penthouse earlier had become something quieter, something closer to genuine curiosity. She slowly looked around the room at the engineers, consultants, and executives who had spent the past week defending reports instead of solving the mystery. "Everyone except Malcolm," she said calmly. "Please give us some space." Chairs slid across hardwood floors as people gathered their laptops and folders. A few exchanged doubtful glances before disappearing into the private elevator. Within moments, the enormous penthouse felt completely different. The distant hum of the city drifted through the insulated glass, while sunlight stretched farther across the floor. Malcolm remained exactly where he was, waiting until the elevator doors closed. He then walked back to the panoramic windows and examined the narrow metal frame running along the bottom edge of the glass. Victoria watched silently. "You noticed the temperature before you noticed the equipment," she finally said. Malcolm smiled faintly. "Buildings tell stories. Most people only listen to the computers inside them." He gently pressed against one corner of the window frame. It shifted almost imperceptibly. Victoria stepped closer. "Is that supposed to move?" "No," Malcolm answered. "It is supposed to seal." He explained that modern intelligent buildings constantly balance temperature, humidity, and electrical load. Even a small structural issue could create subtle environmental changes that gradually affected sensitive control equipment. It was not a software problem at all. It was a chain of physical events that had quietly grown worse over time. Victoria folded her arms again, though this time it was not out of skepticism. She was thinking. "Every expert who came here focused on the system itself," she said. "Because that is what they expected to fail," Malcolm replied. "Sometimes the most expensive technology depends on the simplest things working exactly as intended." Victoria found herself smiling despite the frustration of the past week. "You know, I built my company by telling people to question assumptions. Somewhere along the way, I stopped doing it myself." Malcolm did not respond immediately. He opened another access panel, checked a series of connections, and carefully traced a cable toward a concealed utility wall. His movements remained steady and deliberate, never hurried. Victoria noticed that he treated every component with the same respect, whether it cost $5 or $5,000. That quiet discipline impressed her more than any confident sales pitch ever could. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected across Lake Michigan, sending ribbons of light through the penthouse. Inside, for the first time in days, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt hopeful. Malcolm finally looked back toward Victoria with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. "I believe I know where the failure began," he said. "Now we find out whether the building is ready to tell us the rest of the story." Malcolm traced the main power conduit until it disappeared behind a custom walnut panel built into the far wall of the penthouse. Victoria stepped aside without saying a word, giving him room to work while she watched every careful movement. The silence between them no longer felt awkward. It felt focused. After removing several concealed fasteners, Malcolm eased the panel away and revealed a narrow mechanical space filled with neatly organized wiring, fiber optic lines, and climate control sensors. Everything appeared immaculate at first glance, exactly as the installation reports had described. He reached inside with his flashlight and slowly swept the beam across every connection. Then he stopped. A faint ring of moisture surrounded one small environmental sensor mounted near an exterior support beam. It was almost impossible to notice unless someone knew where to look. Malcolm leaned closer, studying the tiny droplets that had collected around the housing. Victoria frowned. "Condensation?" she asked. Malcolm nodded. "Only a small amount, but it has been happening over and over again." He explained that a microscopic gap in the window seal had allowed warm, humid air to meet colder structural materials hidden behind the wall. The resulting moisture never caused visible damage, but over time it had confused the environmental monitoring system. The artificial intelligence platform responded by constantly recalibrating conditions throughout the penthouse until conflicting sensor data eventually forced the entire network into a protective shutdown. Victoria looked from the sensor to the massive windows overlooking the city. All of this because of something smaller than a credit card? Malcolm smiled. Most complicated failures begin with simple problems that everyone overlooks. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. 7 engineering firms searched for a software bug. Not one of them even questioned the window installation. Malcolm carefully disconnected the affected sensor and examined its contacts before placing it on a clean cloth. "Technology is impressive," he said, "but it still depends on the physical world behaving exactly as expected." Victoria crossed the room and looked out over the skyline. Afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass towers below, while sailboats drifted across the blue waters of Lake Michigan far in the distance. For the first time in days, she felt the weight on her shoulders beginning to lift. She turned back toward Malcolm. "Can you repair it today?" Malcolm met her eyes with quiet confidence. "I can repair the cause. After that, the system should rebuild itself exactly as it was designed to do." He carefully replaced the damaged sensor with a spare from his service kit, resealed the opening around the structural frame, and began reconnecting the control network one circuit at a time. The penthouse remained completely still except for the soft clicks of electrical relays coming back to life somewhere beyond the walls. Then, without warning, a gentle tone echoed through the apartment. One by one, the dormant displays illuminated with a calm blue glow, the climate controls. Synchronized automatically, and the central interface displayed a single message across its screen. "System integrity restored." Victoria stared at the words in complete silence, realizing that the answer everyone had been searching for had arrived in the hands of the one person no one had expected to solve it. The gentle chime confirming the restored system echoed through the penthouse one final time before fading into silence. For several long seconds, neither Malcolm nor Victoria spoke. The intelligent lighting adjusted naturally as afternoon sunlight shifted across the skyline. The climate controls settled into a steady rhythm, and the security dashboard reported every subsystem operating within normal limits. Victoria slowly walked toward the central display, reading each status report as if expecting another hidden error to appear. None did. Every indicator remained green. She let out a quiet breath she had not realized she had been holding for nearly a week. "It is really over," she whispered more to herself than to Malcolm. He gently closed his toolbox and secured each instrument in its proper place before standing. "The system should continue monitoring itself," he said. "I would recommend replacing the damaged window seal completely within the next few days, but the network is stable again." Victoria turned to face him. Earlier that morning, she had looked at him as another contractor arriving to attempt the impossible. Now she saw someone whose patience, experience, and humility had accomplished what expensive expertise could not. She remembered the playful remark she had made before he began working and felt an unexpected wave of embarrassment. It had been intended as a joke born from frustration, yet standing there now, it sounded careless in her own memory. Malcolm, however, showed no sign that he expected anything beyond completing the job. He simply lifted his worn leather tool bag from the floor and reached into his pocket for a folded service invoice. "Here is the repair summary," he said politely. "It includes the replacement part and the recommended maintenance schedule." Victoria accepted the paper but did not look at it immediately. "You are not even going to remind me what I said earlier?" she asked with a small, uncertain smile. Malcolm met her eyes with calm sincerity. "No, Miss Sinclair." She looked surprised. "Why not?" he answered without hesitation. "Because I came here to solve a problem, not to collect on a remark that was made in the middle of a stressful morning." His words carried no judgment, only quiet dignity. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment, realizing that the balance of the conversation had changed completely. Wealth, status, and confidence had given her influence in countless boardrooms, yet none of those things seemed to matter beside the quiet self-respect standing in front of her. She unfolded the invoice and noticed the total. It was remarkably reasonable considering the scale of the repair. "This is all you are charging?" she asked. Malcolm nodded. "It is the standard rate for the work that was required." Victoria smiled softly, almost in disbelief. Most people would have charged far more after solving a problem everyone else failed to fix. Malcolm adjusted the strap on his tool bag. "Doing the right job is worth more than taking advantage of the moment." Those words lingered in the spacious penthouse long after he finished speaking. As he walked toward the elevator, Victoria remained standing beside the restored control panel, watching the doors begin to close. For the first time in years, she found herself far less interested in how someone had repaired her technology than in understanding the character of the man who had quietly walked in, asked different questions than everyone else, and changed the entire day without asking for recognition. Malcolm stepped into the private elevator just as the late afternoon sun cast long bands of amber light across the marble floor. The doors closed quietly, separating him from the luxury of the penthouse and returning him to the familiar rhythm of ordinary work. He adjusted the strap of his tool bag and glanced at the small photograph tucked inside his wallet. It showed his mother smiling in the garden behind her modest brick house on the south side of Chicago, taken years before memory had begun slipping away from her one quiet day at a time. The image reminded him why he never measured success by impressive addresses or expensive contracts. Some victories were found in showing up for the people who depended on you. Outside the building, a cool breeze drifted between the downtown towers as Malcolm loaded his tools into his aging pickup truck. The vehicle had nearly 200,000 miles on it, but the engine started faithfully every morning. He settled into the driver's seat, checked the next service appointment on his phone, and smiled when he saw that he still had enough time to stop by the neighborhood grocery store before driving home. Across town, Victoria remained standing beside the restored control center long after Malcolm had disappeared from view. The apartment felt strangely different now, not because the technology had returned to life, but because the silence inside the penthouse no longer seemed empty. She slowly walked through each room, noticing details she had ignored for months. The soft sound of the ventilation system, the steady warmth of the hardwood floors beneath her shoes. The city reflected in the glass as the afternoon gradually surrendered to evening. Everything worked exactly as it had been designed to work, yet something within her perspective had quietly shifted. She entered her home office and placed Malcolm's handwritten invoice on her desk instead of forwarding it to accounting. His careful handwriting, simple recommendations, and straightforward pricing stood in sharp contrast to the glossy proposals stacked beside it from consulting firms that had promised miracles without delivering answers. Victoria leaned back in her chair and opened her laptop, intending to review the financial reports waiting for her attention. Instead, she found herself searching the service company that had sent Malcolm to her building. His employment record was brief, professional, and surprisingly ordinary. There were no awards, no lengthy biography, no polished marketing language. Just years of consistent work, excellent customer reviews, and countless comments praising his honesty, patience, and willingness to explain complicated problems in plain language. One review caught her attention more than the others. It simply read, "He treats people with the same respect whether they live in a small apartment or a luxury home." Victoria read that sentence twice before quietly closing the computer. She walked back toward the panoramic windows overlooking the Chicago skyline as the first city lights flickered to life below. Somewhere beyond those streets, Malcolm was probably finishing another ordinary day without realizing that the greatest impression he had left behind was not the repaired system or the solved mystery. It was the reminder that genuine character could never be measured by titles, wealth, or appearances, and that lesson lingered in the quiet evening far longer than any conversation they had shared. 3 days passed before Victoria found herself thinking about Malcolm again for reasons that had nothing to do with the repaired penthouse. During a quarterly leadership meeting, one of her vice presidents proudly presented an ambitious proposal filled with impressive charts, polished language, and optimistic projections. As the discussion continued, Victoria noticed something she would have overlooked only a week earlier. Everyone in the room was defending assumptions instead of questioning them. She quietly closed the presentation and looked out across the conference table. "Tell me what we might have missed," she said. The room fell silent. No one answered immediately. She smiled to herself, remembering a man with a weathered tool bag who had solved a $1 million problem simply by asking a different question. That afternoon, after the meeting ended, Victoria instructed her assistant to gather more information about the company that employed Malcolm. She was not interested in recruiting him away from his work or rewarding him with publicity. She simply wanted to understand how someone with such remarkable judgment had remained almost invisible to the business world. The report that arrived later that evening surprised her. Malcolm had once supervised complex engineering projects involving hospitals, transportation hubs, and research facilities. His former colleagues consistently described him as dependable, thoughtful, and exceptionally skilled at diagnosing problems others could not explain. Yet the report also revealed that he had voluntarily stepped away from executive opportunities years earlier to care for his mother after her diagnosis. Victoria leaned back in her chair and read the paragraph twice. There was no dramatic headline, no heroic language, only a quiet sequence of practical decisions made out of love and responsibility. At nearly the same hour, Malcolm was helping his mother water the flowers behind her small brick home. The evening air carried the scent of fresh grass, while neighborhood children laughed somewhere down the block. His mother paused beside a row of blooming roses and smiled warmly. "You have been busy lately," she said. Malcolm returned her smile. "Just another repair job." She nodded gently, unaware of the scale of the problem he had solved only days before. "People trust you because you listen," she said softly. "Your father used to say that fixing things starts with paying attention." Malcolm looked across the quiet yard, hearing words he had not heard spoken in years. Sometimes his mother's memories arrived like distant sunlight breaking through clouds, brief but beautiful. He treasured every one of them. The following morning, Victoria made an unexpected decision. Instead of sending a gift or arranging another expensive gesture, she called the service company herself and requested Malcolm by name for a routine inspection that did not actually require immediate attention. Her assistant looked puzzled. "The system is working perfectly," he reminded her. Victoria smiled as she gathered her notebook. "I know," she replied. "This time I am not interested in the equipment. I think I still have something important to learn from the person who repaired it." The following Tuesday, Malcolm parked his pickup beneath the same downtown tower just after 9 in the morning. The maintenance request listed nothing more than a routine inspection, something that normally required less than an hour. He rode the elevator to the top floor expecting to check sensors, verify the new window seal, and leave before lunchtime. When the doors opened, Victoria was already waiting in the entry hall instead of an assistant or building manager. She was dressed more simply than before, wearing a navy sweater and tailored slacks rather than a formal business suit. The change was subtle, but Malcolm noticed it immediately. "Good morning," she said with an easy smile. "Thank you for coming back." Malcolm nodded politely. "How has the system been performing?" "Perfectly," she answered. "Not a single issue." He looked at the service request in his hand, then back at her. "Then this should be a very short visit." Victoria laughed softly. "Probably." As Malcolm completed his inspection, every diagnostic confirmed that the building was functioning exactly as expected. Temperatures remained balanced. Network performance stayed consistent. The replacement seal had eliminated the moisture that had caused the original failure. Less than 40 minutes later, he closed the final access panel and packed away his tools. "Everything looks excellent," he said. "You should not have any concerns." Victoria hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Would you have a few extra minutes?" Malcolm glanced at his watch. His next appointment was not until early afternoon. I do. She led him toward the kitchen overlooking the city, where 2 cups of freshly brewed coffee waited beside a plate of warm blueberry muffins from a neighborhood bakery. This is not another service call, she admitted with an almost embarrassed smile. I wanted the chance to apologize properly. Malcolm looked at her without interrupting. The first day you were here, she continued, I made a careless remark because I was frustrated and convinced no one could solve the problem. You answered that moment with professionalism, and I have been thinking about it ever since. Malcolm rested his hands lightly on the back of a chair before replying. Everyone says things they would choose differently if they had another chance. Victoria slowly shook her head. Perhaps, but not everyone is fortunate enough to meet someone who responds with dignity instead of resentment. A quiet silence settled between them while sunlight reflected across the windows behind the skyline. Malcolm finally accepted the cup of coffee she offered. Apology accepted, he said simply. Relief softened Victoria's expression. They spent the next half hour talking, not about technology or business, but about ordinary life. Malcolm spoke about caring for his mother, the satisfaction of repairing things that mattered to people, and the neighborhoods where he had spent most of his life. Victoria shared stories about building her company from a small rented office and the loneliness that often accompanied constant success. For the first time, neither of them occupied the role of chief executive or repair technician. They were simply 2 people discovering that genuine respect could begin with an honest conversation and that the strongest connections often appeared only after pride quietly stepped aside. Autumn settled over Chicago with cooler mornings and longer golden evenings. Nearly 2 months had passed since Malcolm first stepped into Victoria's penthouse carrying nothing more than a weathered tool bag and quiet confidence. Their lives had continued in different directions, yet every few weeks they found a reason to meet, sometimes over coffee at a neighborhood bakery, sometimes during a scheduled maintenance visit, and sometimes simply to enjoy an honest conversation away from conference rooms and deadlines. Neither of them tried to impress the other anymore. Victoria discovered that Malcolm measured success by promises kept instead of headlines earned. Malcolm discovered that beneath Victoria's reputation as a relentless executive was someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities that left little room for genuine friendship. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Victoria invited Malcolm to a small community technology fair sponsored by her company. Instead of giving the keynote address, she spent the day introducing local students to engineers, electricians, and skilled tradespeople, reminding them that innovation depended on every kind of talent. When one teenager asked who had inspired the event, Victoria smiled and glanced across the room, where Malcolm patiently demonstrated basic electrical safety to a group of curious middle school students. Someone reminded me, she said, that the smartest person in the room is not always the loudest one. Malcolm looked up just in time to catch her smile and returned it with the same quiet warmth that had always defined him. As the afternoon ended, they walked outside beneath rows of maple trees whose leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk. The city traffic sounded distant, softened by the cool breeze. Victoria paused beside Malcolm's pickup truck and laughed softly. You know, she said, I spent years believing that every difficult problem required a bigger budget or a more impressive title. Malcolm rested one hand on the truck door. Sometimes it just requires someone willing to look a little closer. She nodded. I am still learning that lesson. Before they said goodbye, Victoria extended her hand, not as a chief executive greeting a contractor, but as one friend thanking another. Malcolm accepted the handshake with an easy smile. There were no photographers waiting nearby, no executives watching, and no audience expecting a dramatic ending. Only 2 people standing beneath a quiet evening sky, grateful that a chance meeting had become something built on mutual respect, kindness, and trust. As Malcolm drove away, Victoria remained on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the fading sunlight reflect across the city windows. The world around her looked exactly as it always had, yet she saw it differently now. She had learned that true worth could never be measured by appearance, wealth, or position, and that the strongest connections begin when people choose to see one another with humility instead of assumption. The last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the skyline, while the city lights slowly awakened one by one, and in that calm silence, nothing more needed to be said.